So in the interest of time, we're just at 10:05, so I will get started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Fadilah Ali. I am the Executive Director of the Gulf and Caribbean Fisheries Institute. GCFI is a regional organization that is dedicated to advancing the sustainable use, conservation, and management of marine resources within the Gulf of Mexico and Caribbean. And we have been established for nearly 8 decades, and we foster dialogue and collaboration among scientists, fishers, managers, policymakers, students, civil society, as well as the private sector. We welcome you to join our workshop on non-detriment finding guidance on Queen Conch. This work has been made possible thanks to funding provided by the United States National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and the government of Switzerland. Yesterday, we would have had comments and welcoming remarks and presentations from the Convention on International Trade and Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, which is CITES. And we welcome Karen Gaynor, who is the Scientific Support Officer. Also presenting today, we will have Dr. Richard Appledoon, who is a retired professor of marine science from the University of Puerto Rico at Mayagüez. He has 45 years of experience working on Queen Conch, and he has published extensively on these. He is a longstanding member of the Scientific and Statistical Committee of the CFMC and has served as an advisor to their Queen Conch initiative and as an advisor to many Caribbean countries on Queen Conch assessments. We also have Dr. Nelson Earhart, who is a professor emeritus of fisheries at the Residential School of Marine, Atmospheric, and Earth Science at the University of Miami. And he has 58 years of experience as a fisheries scientist carrying out marine population analyses and fishery stock assessments. He has studied the exploited population dynamics of conch in the Bahamas, Honduras, Nicaragua, and he has conducted work through FAO, CITES, WCAFC, CFMC, as well as GCFI. We also have Dr. Alexander Tufik, who is a benthic ecologist with more than 30 years of experience working with institutions and NGOs in tropical marine ecosystems in the Caribbean, as well as Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. His experience includes field research on populations and small-scale fisheries of Queen Conch across the region. So for today, we will first start off with a short recap of what was discussed yesterday, and this will be done by Nelson. Then Rich is going to take us through the Queen Conch NDF scoring system, as well as some theoretical scoring examples. We will then have a Q&A session, and then finish up with some next steps, which will be guided by Karen. So as a reminder, we do have interpretation available. Please use the bottom ribbon on your Zoom. You will see a globe icon, and you can select your language in either English or Spanish. We encourage you to use the chat box to introduce yourself and communicate with other participants. And please use the Q&A box to pose any questions. We will do our best to answer these questions live, but all questions will be responded to either through a text document at the end. So that's it for me, and I'll hand over now to Nelson to share a recap from day one. Thank you, Nelson.
Thank you. Okay, do you see that now?
Yes, we can see your screen, Nelson.
Okay, good morning. Here today, I'm going to try to be extremely short in just saving time for what is important today. we should summarize based on what you saw yesterday, what the spinal cord is, in the sense that it's important to concentrate on these arrows and how these arrows, in fact, contribute to the total down here. So we're not going to go through all these questions, but what is conceptually important is that we will be navigating around this spinal cord with questions that are related to the nature of the animal, the nature of those that are collecting these animals for commercial purposes, the fisheries, and how then the need of conservation requires not only good regulations, but also the capabilities of enforcement. So basically, my uh, summary is basically the animal is slow mobility that restrict spatial migrations. This will limit the habitat range and it creates all sorts of differences in the growth pattern. Growth, obviously, the measurement of growth, that is to mean the change in size with time, is fundamentally important in any stock assessment. And therefore, we are facing here the difficulty that these animals will grow differently, will generate different levels of yield according to the general ecology where the larvae settles. And then, therefore, we have a complexity of how to extrapolate generality from very specific population dynamics that are especially controlled. And more important is that the reproductive success of these animals is driven by the level of population density. And that is because population density is the mechanism by which mating success comes about. And without having the proper levels of mating success, then recruitment, future recruitment is compromised. We saw yesterday that this density effect on mating and in terms of the overall fecundity of the stock varies also widely according to local conditions and obviously on the intensity of fishing, that is to mean the amount of fishing effort per unit of area that is acting upon these reproductive groups. So the reproductive population density functions are spatially stratified and unequally exposed to exploitation. So those animals that are contributing to the future are unequally exposed to exploitation. And that is a very difficult question to resolve, obviously, and even more difficult to model. Let us remember that in stock assessments, we use models. Models are simple abstractions of the real world. And in order to be valid abstractions, we need assumptions. And those assumptions are conditions under which the models are appropriately applied to the existing data. Population production functions that are usually or fundamentally used in the stock assessments are very complex due, first of all, to the insufficiency of understanding of the reproductive density dependence effects on recruitment. Having said what is in green there in 1, 2, and 3, we must realize that all these items are in the section of insufficient understanding of the reproductive density dependence effects on recruitment. And once again, re-emphasizing, recruitment is our safe account for the future. And if the safe account is not having proper return on investment, obviously we're going to be broke in the future. And therefore, talking metaphorically in economic terms and financial terms, we have the need here for good accounting. And good accounting means to have good data and stock assessment data assumptions and their statistical validity is affected by the spatial exploitation patterns, and therefore there is a compromise on the accuracy and obviously the precision of the population abundance estimates. If we do not have a good grasp of what is happening with these populations, we really are constrained in terms of our own ability to define what is surplus yield. That is to mean the amount of animals in numbers and the meat, the flesh that they contribute to the market that can be cropped from the population without compromising the sustainability or sustenance of the populations into the future. And at this point, obviously, it is always good to remember that these animals were put in Appendix 2 for some reason. And the reason is exactly due to points 1, 2, 3, and 4 that you have there. And the situation under Appendix 2 is that the fisheries and the fate of the fisheries are not as important as the fate of the animals in the population that is being exploited. And finally, the scores in the NDF definitions, which we are going to deal with today, are fundamentally driven by the types of information that we have available. And this could be of two orders. That is to mean quantitative data as well as qualitative data. Both of them are equally important. Both of them are coming from experiences for historic investments on doing things well in terms of understanding the ecology, population dynamics, and the institutionality that is in charge of managing these fisheries, of establishing regulations that are meaningful. And by meaningful, I mean meaningful regarding points 1, 2, 3, and 4, once again, that are in green there. And obviously, the capacity to recover some sort of a rent from the resource at the institutional level that will justify the investment that is required for enforcement of those regulations. So basically, that is what I have for today. Yesterday, we had a very extensive opportunity to present the different topics that are relevant to the definition of the NDFs, and therefore we need these very short memory reminders of what is important for today in terms of the information in the decision making regarding the scoring system. So thank you so very much for the opportunity to recap on this.
Thank you, Nelson. I'm going to hand it over now to Rich, who will take us on a deep dive of the Queen Conch NDF scoring system and looking at a description of the guidance steps and worksheets. So over to you, Rich.
Okay. All right, can you hear me all okay?
Yes, Rich, confirming we can hear you.
There we go. All right. Thank you, Nelson, for that recap. I'm probably going to summarize somewhat what you said in a different way, just to confuse everybody. So just to backtrack a little bit, the essence of an NDF assessment is to manage the levels of risk. So we have unknowns. Unknowns lead to uncertainty, and uncertainty gives us risks. We can offset those risks either by going and getting more information to reduce the unknowns or to introduce precaution through management that would reduce the risk from those unknowns. And so there's a kind of a cycle here, which we talked about in terms of adaptive management, where you go through the process, decide how your management and information levels are and what you need to do to improve in the future. You go ahead and do that, and you run through the cycle again. So what we're going to talk about is the document, and I should start out by saying the document is in both English and Spanish. So most of what I'm going to show on the screen is taken from the document after we get through this little bit of introduction. And so you have the opportunity to look at the information in the slides at your leisure later on. So the guidance is, we view it as a roadmap and a gap analysis. It's a roadmap in the sense that it indicates the path that the scientific authority may proceed progressively to collect information and to assess the information relative to risk. And each step is more or less a precursor to those that follow. And that's why we have this flow chart as a kind of a chain of steps. It's also, however, a gap analysis, because in the process, it will identify gaps in information that we need relative to assessment purposes, and it will identify management gaps relative to identified risks. Now, the approach that we're using is really dictated by two things, as Nelson has been talking about. One is the difficulty in applying traditional models. And that is contrasted with our ability to monitor trends over time. And if we can do that through adaptive management, we are moving toward a multi-indicator approach toward management. But the question then remains, what are the indicators that we're going to use or that we can use? The second factor that's driving is the need for flexibility, and something that Karen mentioned in her presentation. There are differences between countries and their capacities to engage in data collection and analysis. And there are differences in the country situations relative to the size and nature of their conch fisheries. So the approach needs to be flexible to adapt to that. However, we would be expecting the larger economic scale of the fishery, especially industrial fisheries, the larger would be the investment in capacity and management. Now, the document itself, I'm going to break it down into a couple of parts here. It starts off with a summary of key assessment considerations, the role of queen conch in the environment, assessments, and queen conch biology. This is largely what Nelson addressed yesterday. Queen conch products, there's the meat, there's the shell, there's the trimmings that can use for other products, there are opercula that are marketed, and there's pearls. And then there's the information that we need, the type of data and the methods and sources that are useful for those determinations. And that's a table in the document. And I'll go through that table more explicitly in a bit. And again, Nelson talked about the kinds of data and things that we can use to try and come up with metrics that we can track over time. So the bulk of the document is dealing with, obviously, how to use the guidance and the application of the guidance. So the first part of that is how to use queen conch guidance. It gives an overview and a flow chart, and I'll go through the flow chart. And it has some initial information gathering steps in this current version. That's steps 1 through 3 that cover species identification, legal acquisition, and the capacity of the scientific authority, where they can get that if they don't have it internally. As Karen alluded, those steps will probably be taken out of the future final versions of the guidance. So it is more compatible with the generic guidance that CITES has also been working on. So the bulk of what we're going to talk about today are assessment process, and those are steps 4 through 10. Steps 4 through 8 will address risk due to biology, harvest, international trade, and management. And each step gives a rationale, key questions for that step, specific guidance in proceeding through that step, a comprehensive list of factors and indicators to consider and how to proceed. And I emphasize comprehensive list because I'll give an example of what I mean by that. And then step 9 is a gap analysis where you're taking all that information that you've done through 4 through 8 and looking to see how your risks line up to your management strategies. And the step here is, the purpose here, as Nelson alluded to, is to take complex information and get them down to a single metric that is interpretable and actionable. So single metric for each step, if we can do that. And then all that information goes to the final step with making the final decision and giving a summary of that and recommendations for the future. So I just mentioned that there's a comprehensive list in these steps. And this is an example from step 6. And I'm just listing the headings here. But what we've tried to do is list all the things we can think of that would be relevant to addressing, in this case, evaluating harvest impacts and the risks associated with that. And so you can see here there are 14, I think, factors that we could think of. Area, a minimum or maximum size, a closed season, total allowable catch, number of individuals and the density, the size distribution of the stock, the harvestable stock, the size at maturity, catch per unit effort, conversion factors, the size distribution of harvested conch, okay, that's what's the catch, industrial versus artisanal fishing, the use of compressed air for the harvest, and IUU fishing, that's illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing, are factors that go into that. And each of these would be explained. And when we get to step 6, I'll go into these in more detail. What I'm trying to communicate here is that for each step, we've come up with all the things that you could possibly, at least that we could possibly think of, that would be relevant to making an assessment here. This does not mean that you have to deal with all of them, but it does mean you should be dealing with some of them. And so think of it as a list that you can work off of, and the more that you can address, the better off your picture of the fishery is going to be, and the less risk is going to be associated with that. So for each step, those are the factors, and then there would be indicators. And for some of these, you can see they're exactly the same as the parameters, but as indicators, we then give a definition of how you would rank them as low, medium, high, or unknown risk. So that's different from, say, table 6.1. I said we'll get to that, which gives a definition of those and why they're important. Table 6.2 says here's the indicators that come from that and how would they be rated depending on what they're saying about your population or the fishery. So the point here is we've tried to come up with a comprehensive list for each step. It's not something that you have to meet every one of these things, but somewhere in here is where you should be having data available to allow you to look at these issues. The second part of the assessment is the worksheet. So that's a separate document. These are Excel worksheets. There are 13 accompanying worksheets that facilitate the assessment. And if you work through them, these are set up as to form the draft basis, or the basis of a draft report, draft NDF report. So if you do all these things, you basically have the structure all set up. You just need to fill in some wording that connects it all. For steps 4 through 9, there's this a worksheet associated with each one of those, and these are used to enter the information and to document the approach by the CITES scientific authority in assessing that information, as to say, ranking the risk levels and ranking the confidence in those assessments. And for step 10 is the final decision where you record that along with recommendations for future improvements. And these can include data collection, management needs, or efforts to to improve enforcement and compliance. So those are recommendations that would go into step 10. When looking at your sources of information, you're going to be asked to give your level of confidence in that information. This slide information is taken from the worksheets, so that these definitions are in the worksheets. So high confidence would mean that the information is up to date, and it's directly relevant to queen conch. It's perhaps been published in the peer-reviewed literature, or its reference is recognized by CITES. It's just, something that's established information that's current and relevant. At the medium level, it's somewhat dated, but not too much. It may be indirectly relevant to queen conch, and it may be unpublished or not peer-reviewed, but still contains information that might be valid. And it's low if it's going to be out of date and less relevant to queen conch. So here is the flow chart in all its grandeur. And Nelson went through just the spine of this, which is the center lineup of white boxes, and each box is looking at a different issue. So evaluation of conservation concern, evaluation of biological risks, evaluation of harvest impacts, evaluation of management measures, evaluate trade impacts, and the management gap analysis, which then leads to your final decisions. For each one of these things, we're going to be looking at indicators that we're going to rank as high, medium, or low. If all things are good, you're just going to flow through here, everything is low risk. But that's usually not the case. Even for the best managed fisheries, there's always some things that we don't have a good idea for. So here are listed examples of criteria where it might be in yellow, a moderate amount of risk, but perhaps a tolerable amount of risk, depending on how many of these steps fall into the yellow range. Whereas up in the orange, we're looking at much higher levels of risk, and it wouldn't take too much time or too many steps to fall into these categories where you're running unacceptable levels of risks that you have to consider when you are making your final decisions. So again, this is in the document in both English and Spanish. So I'm not going to elaborate on these here because I will be presenting each step in more detail. So I mentioned there's the table on information types and the sources of that information. This table again is in the document, although here it's inverted horizontally instead of vertically in the document. But on the left-hand side, you can see the types of or sources of information that you could get from the types of information. So you can do surveys in situ. You're going to put divers or cameras or something on the bottom and look at the resource. There's dockside or processing plant inspections where you can intercept what's being caught and get information from that. You can look at logbooks or trip tickets or catch reports that may be available. There are interviews that you could do with fishers or perhaps even captains in an industrial fishery. You can do a census of all the fishermen and their gears and whatnot. And then there's independent research that could be available to the management agency and the scientific authority that would come from, say, university studies or other NGOs relevant to their population or queen conch in general that are useful in their situation. So each one of these is a way to collect data. And across here is the kinds of information that you could get out of those surveys. And so 2 points, first of all, is not everybody would be expected, or all countries be expected to have all of these. It's going to be dependent on your capacity, but the greater the capacity, the more you should have. And it's important to try and have redundant sources of information so that you're making sure you don't have some kind of bias in something that you're not catching that if you were to assess it in another way would show up. The second point is that not all information sources give you the information that you would like. So you'd probably want to have multiple types of surveys based on information. So if you want catch and effort information, you're not going to get that from an in situ survey. You will get it from these other sources of information. And so think about what information you can get given your capacities, and what information that allows you to then develop indicators for, if you will. And then you need to design in a statistically rigorous manner, as Nelson went through yesterday, to then use these types of surveys to get reliable information for these categories. So we're looking at population density, population size and age structure, catch size and age structure, those are different. The size at maturity, catch, effort, location for where it comes from, processing levels, reproductive activity, market economic value, biological and ecological information, population connectivity that might come from, say, genetic studies, and natural and human impacts. This is just an example for now. We'll go through this in more detail of what one of the spreadsheets would look like. It would have all the factors that were addressed as potential indicators listed here. Again, each country would not be expected necessary to be able to address all of these. You're going to pick the ones that apply to you and your ability to get data. You would then list what the impacts are. And as I said, I'll go through the definitions and how to rank these as medium, high, low, and what then is your information source that you use to make these judgments, and the confidence level that you have. So this goes to that criteria that I showed a slide earlier about. You may have information, but it may be old or out of date, or not specific to Queen Conch, but to the fishery in general, or it may be very precisely related to the fishery, so your confidence in that information is high. So we're going to be generating information and an assessment of that information of, how bad are the impacts here and what's our confidence in that. So we may have something that says the risk is low, but if we don't really have a high confidence in that, it's more tending toward unknown. And unknown, depending on the factor you're looking at, could be equivalent to high risk, because you just don't know. And if it's related to an important factor, well, that's high risk. You're then going to be asked to take all this information and copy it to the gap analysis. And this is literally a copy and paste exercise. You copy this and paste it into the spreadsheet for step 9, and we'll see that when we get to that step. So the first spreadsheet I want to talk about is this one. It's not associated with any of the steps. It's the information sources that are to be used. And this may be filled out ahead of time, or it can be filled out as you're going, and as you discover more information might be available. But what you're supposed to list here is the full reference for any information that you're going to be using in later steps. So this gives you a complete documentation of the information that you're relying on. And this could be scientific publications, it could be fisheries reports, it could be traditional knowledge from the fishers, it could be expert knowledge from scientists or other members, but you need to document that. So if you're talking about, expert opinion, you would want to list, who the experts were, how was that information attained? Was it in a meeting? Was it attained through a questionnaire or something like that? So it can be understood and rated in the end what the nature and reliability of that information might be. What steps as we go down are you using the information that you have here? And again, the level of confidence in that information, very important. Now, this is just how are you going to, so you're going to reference this information in future steps. And this is just how are you going to reference it? A standard scientific format would be the first author and the year of the publication, but you could just list them as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, A, B, C, D, whatever method you want to organize these. And that's what you would put in the future steps. And as we go through these, remember, except for this slide, actually, I will go through hypothetical scenarios where we filled out the tables or a sketch of how the tables would be filled out. So you can see how this would be done. But this is, I think, really an important step because we're asking you to get all your information together ahead of time, show all the things that you have. So when you move through the steps, you know exactly where the information is coming from. We realize that this step, the first time you do it, is going to be difficult because you're going to have to go through all your old reports, the scientific literature that's pertinent to you, what other information you have, and get it in here and put the level of confidence that's there. But once you have that in a repeated process, you do this again, well, it's all here already. You just have to add, is there a new study you need to available to you that you would add to that? So now I'm going to go through the individual steps. This is step 4, which is the evaluation of conservation concern. And this is the flow chart where we are, evaluate conservation concerns. We could be have a concern where something has been, say, classified as nearly threatened, or something that has been classified as threatened, and maybe there's a higher risk associated with that. And we're going to use that information then to move toward step 5, which is the biological risk. So for step 4, the key question is, considering existing assessments of the conservation status of Queen Conch, what is the indicated severity of the conservation concern? Is this low, medium, high, or unknown? The key thing here is that it's existing information. And that's the asterisk for an example of these sources that might be available to you. And some of these may be generic to the region. Some of them may be very specific to your area, but it's what's available before you even get started. So things like the IUCN Red List, but not just, is it near threatened, but, if you go into those lists, they have more information about how things are throughout the jurisdictions. There's the SPA Annex 3 listings as well. There is the U.S. Endangered Species Act, where Queen Conch has been listed as threatened. But in the documentation for that, they do talk about the situation and information available from specific jurisdictions. So they may say, although it's threatened, perhaps your jurisdiction is not so much, or in contrast, this is an area where there's a lot of concern. If you have past assessments that have been done, These can be used, and this would include past NDF assessments, perhaps. There's traditional ecological knowledge that'd be available from fishers, especially in an artisanal fishery, but you'd want to document how you got that. Did you talk to one person or did you interview a number of them? When was that done, et cetera? And there's expert opinion from, say, the science side, and the same thing would be, okay, expert opinion says that. Where does that expert opinion come from? And you're still going to have to rank it as a high, medium, or low, or unknown risk, as well as whether you have higher, medium, low confidence in that information. And this is the spreadsheet associated, or this is the table associated with the factors to consider for conservation concern. And here we are listing how you would rate the information you have as to low, medium, or high, or unknown conservation concern. If you don't have any information, then it's not known. But if their population has been assessed and has not been considered to be threatened, then past fishery assessments might show that current harvest does not exceed overfishing criteria, you would have then a low concern. If your population has been assessed and is considered to be nearly qualified as threatened, or near an overfishing criteria, say you're right at the level of your total allowable catch, or that factors indicate potential problems are evident, say there's observations of low adult densities or something, that would be a medium. And the population has been assessed and qualifies as threatened under some rankings that have been out there, or your current harvest is in excess of an overfishing criteria, or other factors indicate serious problems, then you're looking at a high risk. So that's where you're starting from. And then this is the spreadsheet. You would just list those factors, whatever information you have is the first left-hand column. And what are they saying about their conservation status? Does this apply to your national or just part of your range of where the clean conch would occur? What are the threats noted in that assessment? Again, what are the information sources used? And here you would just use, say, the author and year of the information that you listed in that first worksheet I showed you, or 1, 2, or 3, or A, B, and C, and then again the confidence limit associated with that. You take however many steps or sources of information you have, so it can certainly be 1 or it can be more than 3, which are listed here. You just add more rows, and you boil that down to one assessment. And is it going to be high, medium, or low? And you are going to then copy and paste that into spreadsheet 9. Step 5, we're getting a little bit more into detail, because now we're going to evaluate the potential biological risks in your population. So again, the flow chart is on the left. If things are fine, you're just going to go on to evaluate the harvest impacts. However, if you have some things that suggest that there's risk, say Apache distribution, some of your distributions are known, but not all of them. There's some environmental problems. We might have a medium level of risk there. If we have a greater unknown extent of the distribution of the resource, there might be little management or no take areas. There's severe environmental problems if you have a near shore fishery with that's subject to runoff or something like that. That might be indicating, moving you toward an assessment that you have a problem. So the key question here is to consider the characteristics of the queen conch's distribution, population, and habitat that affect the potential risk of harvest to the survival of its wild population. And is the severity of risk going to be low, medium, or high? So how do we do this? And so that's where these comprehensive lists come in. So here's both the list for the biological factors and the potential indicators that stem from those factors. And here, I think you'll notice that the indicators are derived directly from those factors. So when we're looking at the biological risk, what's the spatial extent of the population size, the population locations of the spawning areas, what's the spawning season, location of spawning areas, known natural no-take areas. So this would be areas that are inaccessible to the fishery. These could be areas that are too deep to, say, get through diving, or they're areas that are under, say, military control, that divers are not allowed to access and that the military is also not accessing. Threats to coastal activities, as I mentioned before, that might lead to loss of habitat. Increase in water temperature from global warming, that is a risk. Natural disasters that are coming from climate change, and the potential problems that come from invasive species or hostile algal blooms, which have been increasing in some parts of the Caribbean. And so for each one of those, there's an indicator then, and these are all defined, and I'll show that in a second. And we would then, from that, grade each one that for the information that you have is low, medium, and high. So here is what the is in the document. And this is just showing 4 out of the 9 factors that were considered for biological risk. And so this is just the first 4 of them. So spatial extent and population size. The explanation for why this is a factor. A small population or one limit to a small area is more vulnerable to overexploitation or impacts from natural human impacts. However, if high connectivity is demonstrated, the queen population could maintain its stability. Connectivity was an issue that came up yesterday, particularly from that one figure that came from the Vaz paper. But understand, connectivity is really hard to demonstrate. So it's not something you should rely on unless you have, say, specific genetic studies that show that there's an interconnection between your population and another, and it shows that the direction of flow is such that you're receiving conch and not exporting it to someplace else. So there's the genetic similarities between other areas that say you would have connectivity, but that doesn't say which way the flow goes. So as I said, connectivity might give you a buffer, but that's really hard to demonstrate. So the assumptions throughout this document and the assessment is that you have to rely on your own sources of recruitment, your own spawning populations. Location, because of that, locations of spawning aggregations become important. As Nelson mentioned, density is a really important factor, and if you can monitor that, you'll be in better shape. So if the locations are known, they allow for spatial management measures, such as no-take areas, to be utilized to prevent overfishing or habitat destruction of the areas where spawning might occur. Spawning season, if you know what that is, then protecting conch during the peak of the reproductive season can aid in preventing recruitment overfishing. Peak conch reproductive activity is usually associated with the warmest months of the year, but it could also be altered by extreme temperatures or weather for that matter. Spawning season is a driving variable generating nonlinear seasonal effects on catchability coefficients. So if you know what this is, you can start building in some of that information to reduce the risk that might be associated with this factor here. And the locations of these spawning areas, or nursery areas, excuse me, might be different from where the adults are, as was shown in that life cycle graph that was shown yesterday. That quite frequently the juveniles are settling in more shallow or vegetated habitats and then moving into deeper habitats as they mature and get larger. And so if you can protect nursery areas from especially coastal potential damage from coastal activities, you are trying to assure that you have the areas that are going to support the recruitment eventually to the harvested fishery. And then for each one of those, again, this is just showing that the top four is how you would classify the risk as low, medium, and high. So for spatial extent, population size, if conch are abundant and widespread, that would suggest you have a lower risk. If conch are common, but patchily distributed, you're kind of medium, and if conch are not common or only found in selected areas, the risk is higher because you could fish out a small area of population rather rapidly before you even realize that that's what's happened. So these definitions, I'm not going to read through all of them, are in the table for all those 9 factors. The explanations of why they're important or why they're considered, and how to interpret them as indicators. Again, which ones you will use will depend on what sources of information you have available to you due to your capacity. And this would be the spreadsheet that's associated with that. If you come up with other factors that you think might be that we didn't come up with, you can add those lines. But here are the factors that we've listed in our comprehensive list. Not all of them are going to be pertinent to your specific situation. Again, that depends on your capacity to collect what types of data you can collect. What are the risks that these are showing, and therefore, how are you ranking them low to medium high? Now, I mentioned that you're not expected to have an answer to all of these because it is specific to your capacities. But if you have one and the rest of these are unknowns, starting to indicate that you don't know much about your populations. So when you're talking about judgment calls here, you do have to kind of take into account, well, how much do you know relative to what you need to know? So unknowns at some point will count in terms of what you think you know. Again, the information source used and the confidence level associated with that. Okay, so it's been about an hour since we started, and so I've put a break here. Fadilah, do you want to then go with this?
Yes, Rich. I think we do have time, so let's aim for a 5 to 7 minute break. And so we will aim to resume at 11:05. So we'll have a short break and we'll resume at 11:05 Eastern time. Thank you, everyone. We will resume in 1 minute. And just as a reminder, we encourage everyone to use the Q&A box to pose any questions that may arise during any of the presentations, and we will have a very in-depth Q&A session. So please remember to post your questions in the Q&A box and feel free to share anything within the chat amongst other attendees. So we will begin in 1 minute. And just for ease of facilitation, if you do have questions, please use the Q&A box, which is located on the bottom ribbon. There is a question mark. So if you do have any questions, please put that in the Q&A box. Rich, whenever you're ready, you can go ahead and continue.
Okay, thank you, Fadilah. And I should point out, I've been talking about the information available in the document. The document is long and it contains a lot of information, but our team, especially led by Alex, has put together a what we're calling the quick guide. So it's a brief overview of the document and what's in it. So if you are not inclined or don't have the time right now to go through 80 pages of the document, you can use this quick guide to get yourself up to speed and how this process is working. And again, that's in English and Spanish. Okay. So the next step, we're starting to get into the more nitty gritty here, is evaluation the harvest of the impacts of harvest. You know, what impact is harvest having on your population? So again, the step in the flow chart is on the left, evaluate harvest impact. If things are good, you're going to go straight to evaluate management measures, but you might have slight problems. Say there's a decreasing trend in catch per unit effort, or the average size is say above, how that is related to some minimum size, the status of your conversion factors, whatever, that indicate that some precaution is necessary. Or you might have a situation where things are worse. You say there's a very significant decline in catch per unit effort. Average size is declining. You don't have conversion factors, so you don't really able to convert the kind of catch information into biological information. So the key question here is, considering the impacts of all ongoing harvest and all other threats, so this includes IUU fishing, habitat degradation, climate change. So threats on queen conch survival, is the severity of harvest impact on the target population or the national population, depending on where the targeting is going, and on the ecosystem, low, medium, high, or unknown. So in this, we're looking at all the sources of harvest and other threats that could be there, that's going to cause a decrease in the population. But clearly what we're focusing on is the harvest threats. And actually, this is a slide I showed earlier, again, showing the relevant parameters that are to be considered. And in the document, these are all defined as to why these are important. And Subsequently, there is the list of indicators that are used to assess those factors. And you can see in some of these cases, they're the same. But in other cases, there are indicators that are slightly different, but address the factors. And here we have quite a number of indicators. The table 6 goes on 3 pages, so you can see that it's extensive in terms of just interpreting how all these things go through. And here's an example of the first part of that, table 6.1. Again, just showing the top few individuals. What's the factor we're considering and the explanation of why that might be important. So let's go to, say, minimum size, where you could have, for example, a shell length minimum, or a lip thickness minimum, or a weight minimum. So minimum size, this information is used to calculate legality, or the legal, sorry, calculate the legally harvestable or exploitable stock size. That's to say, it's the size of the populations whose shell length is greater than X, or whose lip thickness is greater than N, whatever the measures are. It's to evaluate recruitment potential to the harvestable size classes and to understand the influence of harvest on the population. Correlated weight limits should be available for the whole organism or defined for all processed meat levels if you're going to use weight. So that's one of the factors that we're interested in, and why these factors come important. A closed season, does the closed season align with peak spawning to ensure that there's adequate spawning densities that are maintained during this time, or is it at some other time where it doesn't have this advantage? Total allowable catch, factors such as stock size, stock density, age, and size distribution, recruitment, and catch per unit effort are often used to generate some estimate of what the total allowable catch may be. And so this points to where we might have indicators, right? Total allowable catch is, well, not total allowable catch is not approved by the Chinese Management Authority. Total allowable catch is approved by the local management authorities, but CITES is going to be looking at the export component of that, but we'll be looking at trade in another step. So for each of these things, then we have an indicator and the definitions of what would be indicative of low, medium, and high severity impacts. So for density, and density is a really interesting problem because it depends on how you measure density. But if your harvestable population has a density of greater than 100 conch per hectare, we're considering that low impact. If your harvestable population density is between 150 conch per hectare, you're at a medium level, and if it's below 50 conch per hectare, that might be a sign of potential high risk. Now, I said this is depending on how you measure density, and there's a section about in the document about the different ways you can measure density. So you need to incorporate that thinking into how you're looking at the impact severity. But density is different from spawning density. This is the density actually in the area that where spawning is occurring. And here we're looking at much higher numbers for a low risk, greater than 300 conch per hectare, between 150 and 300. And below 185 conch per hectare in the spawning area, spawning actual aggregations. And these are taken from the scientific literature. Again, there's some latitude in how you interpret these, but these are giving you an idea of where things might fall. Average size in the conch population, if it's well above the minimum size, your fishery isn't really affecting too much the overall size composition, and you're probably good. Or if average size is actually increasing over time, that's an indication that things are good. Average size is significantly above the minimum, but it's variable and there's no trends. You're maybe in a minimum. And if your average size is approaching the minimum size and the size is decreasing over time, those are indications of problems. So these are, again, definitions of what might be considered high, medium, or low severity impact for each of these indicators that we have. The spreadsheet looks like this. Again, it has the list of all the factors that could be considered the indicators. Again, you would not necessarily have information for all these, but you'd want to have information for at least some of these, not just one. And you're going to be ranking that based on the kind of information you have and your confidence in that. So again, you are taking this information, stating what you think the impacts might be, whether that would be a high, medium, or low risk, or you don't know, which we're talking about fishery impacts, may be equal to being high risk, where you got that information, and then your confidence limit in that. So even if you have something that's low risk, if it's old information or not really relevant, your confidence level in that's going to be low. So you have to take that into consideration when you're assessing at the end the information you have available. And this is largely going to be through the gap analysis. So again, there's a cut and paste from step 6 here into the spreadsheet for step 9. Note that you are transmitting this information, you are not transmitting this information over to step 9. So, but you have to remember what your confidence levels are in the kind of information assessments you're making here. Step 7 is looking at the appropriate rigor of existing management measures. So what management measures do you have? If they're in good shape, the rigor is good, we move on. If not, perhaps your management measures have some issues. You have a total allowable catch, but it's the basis for that is not really well established. Your minimum size might be too low to really be effective. You have incomplete catch reports, but at least you have catch reports. So that's a minimum risk. If things are worse than that, you're going up into an area where potential for high risk exists. So the key question, what management measures are functionally in place for queen conch fisheries and conservation? And so it's functionally, you're asked to look at the rigor of existing management measures. Again, it's a comprehensive list of the types of management measures you could have. What you do have is going to be dependent, obviously, on your management regime at present. What you should have is probably going to be more associated with, again, the types of data that you can get and the information and indicators that you can look at so you can relate your management measures to the risks that you are identifying. And that's really what the exercise is in step 9. Here, you're asked to say, okay, what management measures do you have and are they working? Again, so this is a list of the potential things you could have. It's not a requirement to have all these, but you should be looking at some of these in a targeted way such that they alleviate the risks that are going to be, have already been identified or will be identified in step 8. Here is the table for that. The management measures, some of them are listed on the left. And you're asked to say, is this management measure documented somehow in either a law or a regulation that comes from a law, or is it just a practice that may be voluntary, or just how well documented is this? Specify, say, the law that it's in. What is the expected conservation impact of that management measure? And there might be some that don't have an expected conservation. If you have a management measure that requires industrial vessels to meet certain certifications for operation, that's important for your fishery and your management, but wouldn't necessarily have a conservation impact. So we're looking here at these various measures. A quota or a total allowable catch is obviously trying to reduce fishing mortality to a tolerable level. Minimum sizes might be trying to protect your spawning stock. Closed season might be trying to protect spawning, the population during spawning, et cetera. So here's the expected conservation impacts. These would be in the information provided. And then the real questions are, is there routine monitoring and enforcement? So that's to say, are these management measures effective? Are the fishers and others involved complying with these management measures? And in some, to the degree that they are potentially alleviating the risk that you have already or will be identifying. Again, the sources of information used for these might be the laws themselves that you might put in here, but there might be other information, again, from fishers, other experts that talk about whether the enforcements are really effective or not. And again, your confidence level in those sources of information. Here's what the spreadsheet looks like. It's basically what I just showed, and you're going to fill in that information. The spreadsheet does say if you have a minimum size or a maximum size, please specify what that is. If there's a closed season, what's the time period that it applies to? If you have no-take areas that contain conch, what percentage of the population might be contained in those no-take area? If you have limited entry, what's the number that are allowed in? If it's industrial vessels, how many of those? If it's artisanal, how many fishers? However you define limited entry. And again, these are going to be brought over. Now, this is not a cut and paste exercise here. This information is going to be brought over into step 9 where appropriate. And you're going to be basically asked to remember all this because you're going to apply these to different risks. And so if you're talking about the risk to your spawning population, well, that might be a minimum size, it might be a maximum size, a closed season. There might be several management measures that affect your ability to protect your spawning individuals. And so, or to reduce fishing mortality besides just a quota, having a closed season or closed areas may also be factors that are can be used to reduce fishing mortality. So they'll show up in multiple places, and we'll see that when we get to step 9. Step 8 is the evaluation of impacts of trade. Again, its step in the flow chart is over here. And we're considering the impacts of trade on queen conch survival, as to say, is the severity of all legal and illegal trade impacts on the harvest area population and the national populations, low, medium, or high. Again, we're looking at not just what you know, but illegal trade, what you are information you're able to get on the scale of illegal trade. And say, for example, in Jamaica, when we've done assessments there, we asked basically the companies that are dealing with the boats to give an assessment of what they think illegal fishing is on Pedro Bank, for example, because they do see foreign vessels there, and that from that is an estimate of what might be taken off, and that's part of what's considered the harvest. Again, there's factors to consider for the impacts of trade. These are listed here. There's the weight of exports relative to the total catch, the weight of exports relative to the queen conch population, if you've been able to assess what the population size is. There are trends in demand and trends in the price per weight. Again, I will emphasize that trends are really important, more so than single values in all these factors and indicators. Do you have proper trade documentation, not just for what you're exporting through CITES, but through what might be landed and being used domestically? Is there traceability? Is there a possibility of mislabeling? Is there a reporting system? So catch reports for landings or exports. So these are the factors we're considering. Those are defined in the document, and then these are the indicators that might come out of a consideration of those factors. So, for example, your weight of exports relative to total catch. If your weight of exports is low, say below 20% relative to total catch, the impact of the trade might not be substantial and therefore of low risk. But if you're getting up to where you're 20 to 50%, you're getting into kind of a higher risk. And if the exports are above 50%, well, those exports are driving, that trade is really driving the fishery at that point. And you're at a higher level of risk. And if you don't know what's going on here, this is where unknowns really come into play as levels of high risk. And so, again, we've defined all these and how you can interpret them. There's obviously always some room for discretion in how to interpret these, but you're asked to take the information you have, how good that information is, and interpret it in light of all these the definitions that we're giving here for low, medium, and high. The spreadsheet is looks like this. And it's exactly what we saw before. You're filling in the impacts for the information that you have for the factors that you have data for, and ranking those low, medium, and high, the information and the confidence level for that. And again, there's a cut and paste of this step into step 9. And step 9 is where we put everything together. And so this is the gap analysis, and it's a summary of the steps from 4 to 8. So we're evaluating the effectiveness of our management measures relative to the identified risks. So the key question is, do existing management measures adequately mitigate the harvest impacts identified for national populations of queen conch? And the worksheet for step 9 aims to provide a synopsis of the previous steps. So you're transferring the results, as I mentioned, from conservation concern, biological risk, to from those worksheets into the upper part of this worksheet for step 9. You'll see that in a second. You're transferring the harvest impacts and the trade impacts from the worksheets in steps 6 through 8 in the lower part of the worksheet. And then you're placing your existing management steps from step 7 against those previously identified trade and harvest impact risks. So, which are now in that lower part of the worksheet with step 9. And so step 9 will identify possible major shortcomings in the current management relative to the identified risks. They'll provide an overview of the entire NDF process to inform your final NDF decision and provide the basis for making recommendations to address those identified gaps, either in information or management. Please don't try to read this. This is what the spreadsheet looks like. I mentioned there's an upper part and a lower part. This allows you to have all the information that you have been generating so far from steps 4 through 8 put in one place so you can look at it all together. So when you're coming to your decision, step 10, you're looking at all the information you have, you're looking at your management measures, and you are considering the quality of the information that went into those and making a judgment call on where your fishery stands. And I point out that we do have a numerical guidance guide to as an indicator of where your scores are falling. But this step is going first, and I'll now go down to each individual components of these so we can blow them up and show what they contain. And as a reminder, the next component that I'm going to present after this stage is how to use all these worksheets for 2 hypothetical situations. So we'll actually start putting words and numbers and whatever into all the spreadsheets and see how that might then generate a score of a good NDF or a moderate NDF or however you want to call those things. So let's look at the top part of this. Here are the parts from step 4 and step 5. Again, you're going to be putting in the ones you have information for, but you're cognizant of what you don't know, because at some point, a level of high known starts, a high level of unknown across many categories starts indicating high risk. But this is all the information you've had, and it's just copy paste into that section. On the left side, you are copy and pasting step 6 and step 8, the information from those. And then on step 7, the information from step 7, your management measures, you're going to bring those over to, and each measure will be put against what risks you've identified through the harvest impact or the trade impact. And as I said, if you're looking at catch per unit effort, what are the management measures you have in place that might help to control any risk associated with the levels of catch per unit effort? And you're asked to, rank those, and, in terms of the risk associated with these. There's effective implementation, appropriate rigor. There are issues that need to be addressed, or you don't really know what's going on. So and I think this will become a little clearer when we go through the examples, and you'll see how some of these have been filled out. But for each management measure, you will put it against what factors you think those address, and try to say how well it addresses those factors. And lastly, there's what we call the summary scoring step. And it takes each one of your, so this is a slightly different approach. It takes each one of the 4 steps and asks you to rank it as low, medium, high, low, medium, or high risk. And some will be, low. Maybe there's, you haven't had much fishing going on. Your population is healthy at the moment. That's going to be low risk, maybe for the first 2 steps. And then you have to evaluate what you are considering in terms of potential harvest and what you don't know and how those fill into here. But for each step, you're asking to reduce that information down to a single score. And that score is going to be low, medium, or high. And we're simply putting this into, if it's low, it gets 2 points. If it's medium, it gets 1 point. If it's high, it gets no points. These get added up. You get a percentage in total number of points. The maximum number of points is 12 because there are 6 factors here. And if you score perfect on low risk for all of them, that's the most you can get. And then we have the recommendations for how you could interpret that. So if you are above a score of 9 or above 75%, you're doing really well. And you have a good NDF recommendation. If you're somewhere in the middle, above 50% or higher, you would things are okay, but you have some gaps that you should be addressing. So that will inform what you're going to put in your step 10. And then again, if your score is below 50%, there are some issues that really need to be addressed. And this is then taking you to step 10, which is the final step. It's where you're going to pick one of these, right? Where this is where you actually have to make a choice. And so it could be a negative NDF that says you're not going to approve export. It could be a positive NDF, that things are good. There could be a conditional NDF that says yes, but there's specific conditions associated with that. And there might be then a time frame for when those conditions should be met to move from here to here. Or there's an other where you just don't have information yet to perhaps say information is pending, but we can't make a decision yet on this particular petition for export until that information is available. So those are your options here, and then you're asked to justify your decision here, and you could just refer to see the worksheets and the supplementary scoring guide, and that itself kind of gives the explanation, or you could give a more text format for the advice that you give. Remember that this is the advice of the scientific authority, and it's their job to interpret all these steps, and so it's how they interpret that which will affect what the score is, and if they want to depart from that, this is why, because they have some issues that they think were not captured perhaps in this thing. And then if you have specific management measures or precautions or other actions, information that you would like to get, this is where those recommendations would go. So that is the document. And as I said, I think a lot of this will become more clear when we go to the hypothetical examples and we actually see how these spreadsheets get filled in. So I'm suggesting another break at this point. Fadila?
Yeah, it's Rich. We can probably do a 5 minute break and then go straight into the next presentation, and then we do questions after the two presentations, because I think you may cover some of the questions people might have in that. So we'll commence again at 11:45. We do recognize that a lot of the content being shared today is quite technical, so that's why we have incorporated so many short breaks. So we will commence at 11:45.
12:45.
I'm using Eastern
Eastern.
time, so it's 11:45. So
All
in
right.
5 minutes, 45 minutes, whatever time zone you're in. Thank you, everyone. We are going to get started again in a minute. Once again, I want to encourage everyone to use the chat box to share any comments or any information that you would like with the other attendees. And we encourage anyone that has questions to use the Q&A box to pose any questions. And after this presentation, we will have time set aside to answer any questions that you may have. So please, we encourage you to pose questions throughout the presentation. So Rich, whenever you're ready, please go ahead.
Okay, so to switch presentations, I think I need to stop sharing.
Yes. Do you need my assistance for you to stop sharing?
Oh, wait a minute. Yeah, I guess I do.
Okay. I've stopped your share and you should be able to put the new one up.
Okay. You should see the full screen then for the title.
Yep, we can see it.
All right, so what we're going to go through here are two hypothetical scoring examples that were developed by the team. They are truly hypothetical. They did not come from thinking about one country or another country. It's just so if you think it's referring to you, it's not. And the first one is looking at a fishery that is modest in size in terms of its export. It has some institutional framework. It cannot, however, meet all the CITES requirements for export. Okay, so there's going to be some, but not all. The landings are for this fishery are going to be from the coastal shelf. There is a significant contribution from artisanal fishing, but there is a smaller contribution from some industrial vessels. The biological condition is basically known. There's some risk, which is supported by the scientific literature, but it's not overwhelming risk. The impacts of harvest, however, are not well under control. They don't have valid conversion factors. There's a slight decline in catch per unit effort, and their enforcement capabilities are somewhat insufficient. And the immediate management measures include annual quotas, but they're not established from a rigorous, fully tested scientific basis. So they're in place, but the basis for them is not really well established. They have some enforcement that cannot timely control the quota fulfillment and stop fishing. So as the quota gets filled, they're not monitoring it fast enough to say, wait, we've reached the quota, stop. Other measures address some, but not all of the identified risks, and we'll see as we go through there. In this case, we have limited data sources. Say there's for example, port sampling of catch and effort, but it's intermittent in time and it's not done in a statistically rigorous manner. And there are some in situ studies based on academic publications that give an indication of perhaps density, spawning behavior, but not necessarily the rate of or the level of spawning, just that it's that occurs, and some information on the age structure. The existing management measures are quota, but it's not through, as I said, not set through an assessment. There is a minimum size, which was designated as 18 centimeters shell length. There's a closed season, which is during the peak of the spawning season. There's dockside inspection, but only in some years. And there's a certification system, but it only covers industrial vessels. So the first step is step 4, there are conservation concern. And here we have a couple of studies that have looked at these. I mentioned academic studies. So one by Garcia, active age structure of the conch resource, one by Smith, conch densities in the major fishing area. And they've also used information from the U.S. Endangered Species Act listing. I should point out that in filling these out, I've just kind of given a sketch of how you would fill them out. And I haven't done them for all of the boxes. It's just to give you an idea of how they would be looking. So for information sources, you just might have to list Garcia, Smith, US ESA, because in that first spreadsheet where you list all the documentation, you would give the full citations for these. And so what was the threat that was noted in these? Well, Garcia said that there were a few old adults that were observed in that study, which would indicate that there's a higher mortality rate that's not allowing those old adults to survive that long. Perhaps adult densities in the major fishing areas are marginal. And the Endangered Species Act is saying it's vulnerable cost of range, which is not necessarily specific exactly to the jurisdiction, but is an indicator. And so these are past studies that were used. The levels were all medium, and which makes it easy because when you fill in this, the step is going to rank as a medium. And yes, this is distorted here because I've distorted the spreadsheet, so the font is legible, but all the boxes are there. So you're saying here, and we're using Garcia and Smith and US ESA Act as our indicators. And that box then gets copied over to step 9. In step 5, it's potential biological risks. And here I've only done these first 2, but must be sources of information to answer these things. But the spatial extent, population size, okay, conch are widely distributed, but they're also patchily distributed. And so that patchily distributed comes out as a medium. And again, we're citing the Smith paper. Some of the aggravations are known to occur in 60 feet outside the cuts in the reef track. There may be other aggregations that are deeper, let's say greater than 80 feet or further offshore. And this is coming from stuff reported in the Jones paper, observations on spawning behavior. Again, they're not looking at the total population or at the rates of reproduction. It's just that there may be areas, so it's a medium, but you still have some information. The spawning season is April to October. That covers the peak of the spawning season where there's a closure, so that's the low risk initiative. Some nursery areas are known. There may be deep nursery areas. So we're saying medium, that would probably be referring to the Jones paper. Are there any natural no-take areas? There are no designated reserves, but maybe deep areas that are unfished conch, but that has not been documented. So that's an unknown. The rest of these are unknown as well. So we have a medium, medium, high, medium, and some unknowns, but we do have some information to look at the biological risk. And that information, again, will be copied over to step 9. Harvest impacts. Again, we have some more information. There's a paper by Acosta, conch port sampling and catch-breeding NDF along the West Coast, and Rodriguez, a paper looking at West Coast port sampling revisited. So he's kind of redoing what Acosta did. And that's showing that there's a slight decline from surveys that were 5 years apart. There's no statistics on these because the surveys are not statistically rigorous, but there is an indication that catch-breeding effort may have declined, but not a lot, so medium. Density is variable. The conch are still broadly found. They're pouchy. Again, looking at the Smith paper, that's medium. Spawning densities. Spawning has been observed, but the densities were not assessed, citing the Jones paper. So again, we know something. It's a little bit of information. It's medium. We don't know information about the average size of conch in the population because there really hasn't been a benthic survey to do that. The size composition, again, is what we had from the Garcia papers, not many old adults. So that's kind of a moderate indicator. There are no conversion factors. They're using the regional estimates. That's not good. So there's more of a high risk associated with that. And we don't really know about recruitment because that's not been studied. Again, all this gets copied into step 9. This is harvest impacts. Again, here are all the factors that could be considered. There's a bunch we just don't know because we haven't been collecting information on them. Distribution of fishery effort is generally known and it's concentrated in a few areas. So this is the Acosta and the Rodriguez studies that have gotten that kind of thing from talking to the people during port sampling. They know that it's mostly artisanal, but there are 2 industrial vessels. That's not a lot of industrial pressure, so that's given a moderate. Compressed air is used, and fishery does really go down to 80 feet. That's going to be considered moderate. Reproduction, is it frequent or not? It's been observed, but the frequency has not been documented. Again, that was one of the publications that looked at spawning behavior, and are the spawning protected areas protected? Spawning areas protected? The answer is no. So that's a higher risk. And then here's the sources of confidence we have in these assessments, right? And again, I haven't filled in the sources of information here, but they would be some of the studies that we've already referenced. And this would be copied over to step 9. Now here's the management measure, and we're looking at the rigor for the management measures. And again, we have a comprehensive list of what you could have. You can see here from the very big, very obviously, there are no management measures that address these issues. There's not a vessel monitoring system. There are not accountability measures for when the quota or the total allowable catch is exceeded, but we do have things. We do have a quota, but as we said, it's not based on an assessment. It's defined in the fishery regulations. We really don't know what the conservation impact of that is. It hasn't really been studied. And it's only monitored for exports. Remember, exports are not a large part of the fishery. It's less than 20%. Information sources could be used, whatever these. I just put, okay, general fishery regulations from 2001 and our confidence levels in that kind of information. Size minimum is also by regulation. It's protecting only the smallest adults. It it therefore might be limited in its how it's monitored and enforced. As to say, it's largely trusting the fishery to maintain that, but there isn't a rigorous dockside or other management intervention to see that it's strongly being adhered to. But there's something, so medium. We have a closed season, and its closed season will help to support peak spawning period, and closed seasons also help to reduce fishing mortality. It's through regulation. How well this is complied with and enforced is our knowledge of that is limited, so it's medium. We have dockside inspection, but only in some years. It's not really specified in a law or regulation. It does allow some potential tracking of catch per unit effort, as we had the study done in 2 years. However, it's voluntary compliance in terms of those surveys that are done. And our confidence limit then might be low for those. And there's a certification system under regulation, but it's for economic purposes and safety purposes. There is enforcement of that, but it's only covering, so our confidence level is high, but it's only covering the industrial fishery. And so this information, again, is going to be copied over to step 9 as appropriate to that steps. And I'll show you that when we get to that step. The last one, we're assessing the risk before we get to step 9 is step 8, the trade impacts. What's the weight of exports relative to total catch? It's thought to be about 45% of the catch. So again, that was medium. But we really don't know because we aren't really monitoring the local domestic catch. And so that's based on some expert knowledge, and we would want to elaborate that in that first spreadsheet that gives the knowledge about where that expert knowledge came from and how old it is and how broad it is. So the weight of exports relative to total population is unknown, which is why we couldn't answer the first question. There's no detailed population assessment as well, so that's unknown. The trend in demand is increasing. The trend in price per weight is increasing. So that's indicating some moderate concern. The documentation for domestic trade is incomplete. So we don't really know how much is being harvested for domestic use. And there could be some secondarily entering the export market. So there's not a good tracking of the domestic artisanal fishery. There's a general understanding of the chain of trade, but the details are incomplete. There's a potential for mislabeling, but it's considered low to negligible. And there is a reporting system for landings and exports, but it's only for the exports, right? So most of those are mediums. There's an unknown relative to the weight of exports, and our confidence limits for some of these are medium and what is low, because here we're dealing with expert knowledge. We don't really know how strongly to judge that. And so this again is going to go into your step 9. And now we're going to go to step 9. And all we're showing like here is that we have copied over from step 4, that one line, and from step 5, the information here relative to their scores. I've not copied over this. It was in the assessment. It was in the spreadsheet, but I'm trying to reduce how much extra writing we have to do here. But these are important to know because we want to know what our levels of concern are overall. The more important ones are here. And so here's where we're matching up our management measures relative to our risk assessments for harvest and trade, and how they score relative to um, addressing those risks. Oh, I should have mentioned, go back. Oh, okay, I will go back. In step 9, there is a request that you place a red dot, and the red dot is on the spreadsheet, so you just have to copy it into the appropriate areas where you think emphasis really needs to be placed. And so we've put these in here for this example, and actually for both examples, they're the same. This is possibly because the approach that we're taking in terms of the structure, the actual physical structure here, was taken from the NDF guidance for timber, where they're dealing with multiple species, and the factors that might be important for different species might be different. It is possible, and we haven't discussed this amongst the group, whether these factors would always be the same for conch. And so that's one of the things that will be addressed when we update the manual. But the red dots are indicating areas where it would be really nice to have um, good information both on what the threats might be and how management addresses those. So here, catch per unit effort, we've copied over the slight decline from surveys 5 years apart. We gave that a medium. What do we have in assessment that is addressing that? Well, we have a quota. So that's something that will help reduce fishing mortality and should maintain a catch per unit effort, but it's not set through an assessment. So we don't really know how effective that is. And it's getting kind of a moderate score in terms of its ability to address the threat. For density, we don't have any management measures that address density per se. For spawning density, we also don't have management measures that address the density per se, but we do have our closed season, which allows peak spawning to occur undisturbed, such that whatever the density is, it can be maximized. And we know we have good reason to think, because we're monitoring landings at least to some degree, that that closed season is being adhered to. When we look at the size composition, we don't have a lot of information, but there's not many old adults. That being said, that's moderate in our concern. Again, we have a quota, but it's not set through assessment. We do have, however, a minimum shell length, but that's only protecting the smallest adults. So, but we think that it's kind of being adhered to. I think that was the expert opinion there. Conversion factors are not calculated. That introduces a lot of uncertainty into what's actually being reported, so that's a higher risk. Some of this we don't have information on, so they're all unknowns, higher risks. Now, some of these are all, these are all the potential impacts. Some of these we can't assess. That's why they're unknowns. Some of these, you can see, I'm just going to go through here, that things like closed season are applicable to looking at, is reproduction frequent? Are the spawning areas protected? Well, during the closed season, they are. Closed season is also looking at spawning density. Quotas are being used to look at catch per unit effort, what might be able to maintain the size composition, and what might be used for regulating the amount of fishing going on, especially for the industrial vessels, because the catch theirs are actually being monitored. So you put in your management measures where they might possibly offer some amelioration for the risks that you've identified. And you can see we have a lot of unknowns here, some of them because we don't have the data streams to address them. But again, we have to take into account how much we know versus how much we don't know, and how well we know what we know when it comes down to make a final decision. If we go further down, now we're looking at the trade impacts. We don't have a lot of measurement measures that are looking at or can address the indicators for trade impacts. But we do have information on the trend in demand. We have dockside inspection, but it's only voluntary and periodic and not statistically rigorous, but we have something. So that's here. We're not really addressing some of these other indications of trade impact in the management measures that we have. This brings us to the supplementary scoring system, where we're looking at what came out of the steps that we were looking at. And basically, there was some conservation concern that came out of step 4, so that was the median. But our biological risks seem to be reasonable, so that gets a low risk, a 2 score. And for everything else, we had some information, but we really weren't dealing with everything that we should. And so we have medium levels of risk, and our total score is 7, the 2 and the 5, 58%. And that puts us into this category, suggesting that we have gaps both in our information and in our management. And these should be considered by the scientific authority in their recommendation. And that might be something like a conditional positive NDF, where they're going to go ahead and okay the export, but we would like to see improvements in management and information gathering in the future for this to continue. So that's scenario 1. And you come up with your spreadsheet, step 10, because of this. Conditional NDF is what's kind of indicated that, so it's a yes, but with specifications. So for justification, we're saying, see the worksheet and summary 9, but the list of recommendations would be: a routine statistical survey needs to be implemented to obtain catch per unit effort and catch size composition, or density and population size composition. Conversion factors need to be determined. Size limits need to better protect future spawning. So that might mean you increase your minimum size, or introduce a ellipse thickness basis. So these are just the kind of data and management types of things that would be suggested from looking at what you have relative to the risks that you have identified. So this is a scenario where you come up with what we're calling a conditional NDF. The next scenario is where we're in better shape. The country has a history of significant queen cock exports with both industrial and artisanal fisheries. There's landings, particularly for export, are from a large offshore bank. Most of the catch is from the export-oriented industrial fishery. Some artisanal harvest occurs both offshore and in shelf waters. The biological condition is basically known. There's some risk, but it's low, and this is supported by the scientific literature. The impacts of harvest offshore are not well under control, because there's insufficient enforcement capabilities in offshore areas. The management measures are intermediate to an advanced level. So they have annual quotas that are tested and generated support to legal frames for management. There's sufficient personnel to timely control the quota fulfillment process and be able to declare in a timely fashion seasonal closures. The impacts of trade are well established, and management measures are somewhat haphazardly mitigate the risk and impacts, but there are quite a number of management measures. So there's dockside collection as their sources of data. There's catch and effort sampling sustained over time. There's logbook inspections sustained over time. There are captain interviews that go along at this dockside data collection period. There are mandatory catch reports that come out of that, both for the industrial fishery and the artisanal fishery. There's a biennial benthic survey of conch on the offshore bank that looks at density, size, structure, and distribution. In situ studies, there's some academic publications that look at spawning rates in no-take areas. And there's clear expert documentation and pretty good traceability. The existing management measures, there's a total allowable catch, and it's determined by a survey-based harvest control rule. So depending on the output of the survey, which you're estimating potential population size, exploitable population size, this indicates how much you can take. So that's going to change each year as the new data comes in, or every 2 years. There's a minimum size of 20 inches or 20 centimeters now, shell length or 9 millimeters in lip thickness. There's a closed season for the peak of the spawning season. There's limited entry on the number of industrial fishing vessels, set at 7. Mandatory catch reports, log book inspection. There are some no-take areas. 5% of the bank is closed by regulation. So it not necessarily focuses on the spawning areas, but 5% of the banks are closed, and there is a vessel certification program. Going to the spreadsheets, there are 2 data sources that are used to look at the conservation concern. One of those is the U.S. Endangered Species Act. And there's one that's looking at the harvest rates at Banco Grande, that's the offshore bank, and it's looking at the proportion of harvested shells that have been left behind. And a similar study, are old conch disappearing, overfishing, or is it fishing surplus biomass? So what's the level of concern there? They're medium. I actually forgot to put those in there. And what we're saying overall for this step is medium, and it's based on these 3 references, Diaz, Cook, and the ESA. If we look at potential biological risks, we now have a lot of information. There's 2 categories that are unknown. We really haven't been able to assess how we should look at natural disasters. In other words, is there a track record of how frequently hurricanes come through and how much damage they occur, for example? That hasn't really been looked at. But we have a lot of the factors here. We have information on. Again, we have information on a number of studies looking at, and we've brought expert opinion into some of these things. So the spatial extent, they're abundant. The size structure is known because we're doing in-water surveys. It's mostly stable over time. Older conch are still found, but they've declined somewhat. Nevertheless, it's indicating a low level of risk for that factor. Spawning locations, Various studies have observed spawning, which gives a broad spatial extent, but gaps are still known, so we're calling that medium. The temporal extent of the spawning season is well documented. So that's a medium, is well documented. It's low. There are indications of the locations of the nursery areas, but they're not completely documented. And that's a medium. Deep areas of Banco Grande are not exploited because they're too deep. But it's thought that they are supporting spawning conch based on a study by Acosta. What are the threats to coastal activities? Well, Banco Grande is an offshore bank. Those impacts are expected to be low. Is there effect from increasing temperature from climate change? Again, Banco Grande is not shallow and it has a good current flow. So extreme temperatures are not really considered a problem. That's considered low risk. And again, we're ranking our confidence levels in those. Expert opinion has a low confidence level, but at least it's some information. What we're coming out, as you can see, better than we did in the previous hypothetical situation because we have more information. Harvest impacts. You can see right from the very beginning, there are no unknowns in harvest impacts. And there are a number of lows, and the rest are mediums. There's only one high impact, and that's all the fishing is done with compressed air. And there was a study by Trudeau that documents that here's the reference for that. And so we will look at catch per unit effort. Although catch per unit effort is variable, it has remained somewhat stable over time. So there's a variance associated with that, but it's somewhat stable. So we're giving that a low risk. Average densities have been remaining stable over time, low risk. 20% of the survey stations on adult densities have above a 300 per conch hectare. So they're showing good spawning density. I missed putting the X in there. You go down these things. So there's an explanation for all of these as to why they're scoring medium or low, or in the one case high. The documentations are here, and the confidence level in that information is there. So again, you're just filling in the data as you can get it. Now here are the management regulations. Again, there are more regulations here than before. There is a quota, and it's under a harvest control rule, so it's well maintained. It's under the regulations. And it's designed to maintain the fishery mortality below that mortality thought to contribute to maximum sustainable yield. There's routine enforcement here, and so the confidence limit and the effectiveness is moderate. We have a size limit that's, I think this is actually 10 inches. So it allows for an increase in yield per recruit. It allows some maturation prior to fishing mortality, and our confidence limit in that is high. Reduced fishing mortality is affected by a closed season. It's in the peak spawning months, and based on our information, it's well enforced, but there's little at-sea surveillance. But based on what's landed, it seems to be working. There are other things here: catch reports, log inspections. They're expected to allow us to estimate catch per unit effort and track the quota. So these are the expected conservation impacts that these regulations have, and we get over to what our confidence limits are in those regulations, because some of them have really good enforcement and monitoring. And this information then will be brought over again as appropriate to see how we are assessing our identified risks. And the last table for that is 8. And here all of the risks have been addressed to some degree. There is a traceability system through the supply chain, so that's low. There's not much chance of mislabeling. That's negligible, so low risk there. We do have a reporting system, so it's rigorous reporting requirements. So the risks there are also low. Demand is increasing slightly, so there's an indication of some moderate risk, and the price is also increasing slightly. So again, moderate risk. The exports constitute 75% of the catch. That's indicating there's a high potential for risk based on that. The quota is based on 6% of the exploitable biomass of the field survey. So that's the harvest control rule that they're using. And that's because that's well under control, that's also given a low risk score for that. And again, I haven't filled all the potential sources of information there, but our confidence limits here are running fairly medium and high. So we're in a pretty good step for the management measures that we have in what they can control for. And that information is going to be brought into the step 9 worksheet. Again, this is just what we've copied over from steps 4 and 5. Here's what we've copied over from step 6. And you can see from the management measures, there's a lot more being filled in here because there's management measures that will address in some way many more of the risk indicators that we have here. So having a survey that's the basis for the total allowable catch, and that we have enclosures, we have size limits, we have closed areas, limited entry, and these can apply to several different areas of management concern relative to trade impacts or the risks associated with trade impacts. So again, we're looking pretty good here because a lot of our management is addressing to some degree the risks that are we've identified here. And so there's fairly appropriate, a number of things where they're appropriate. There's one here where it's actually very strongly implemented, and the other ones are some moderate, but there's not too many of those. So that's pretty good shape. Now we're looking at the harvest impacts. Excuse me, this is trade impacts here. The previous one was harvest impacts. The only warning site here is exports are 75% of the catch, but we do have management that addresses that. So it's ameliorating that level of stress or risk rather. And we're also addressing some of even our moderate sources here fairly well. Mislabeling was negligible. There's dockside inspection. In some, you're doing fairly well. And we go to the summary scoring things. Remember, there was some concern for the based on past studies, but it was of moderate nature. But we were doing really well in evaluating the biological risks and the harvest of impacts, and evaluating the trade impacts, and evaluating the management measures. We gave that a medium score. Maybe that could have gone to a low risk score. Our overall score is 9.75%. We're well in that good NDF level where it's indicating that we would have no problem making a recommendation of a positive NDF. And this is then what we're seeing here is that a positive NDF is being indicated in step 10. And the only recommendation, what efforts should be made to improve enforcement at sea, such as increasing patrols or instituting the VMS system into the management regime. So those are our examples. And we're going to then open this up for questions now again, Fadilah. I'll stop sharing.
I can help you with this. Okay,
I
there
got
we
that.
go. Thank you, Rich. I'll invite the entire team to come back onto screen to answer questions. While I wait for that, I do notice in the chat that John Clayton posted a question very recently, asking Alex to expand further. John, could you repost your question to specifically ask what you would like expanded further? Because I think it's related more to a timestamp than anything else. So if you can refine your question, we'd be happy to answer that. We would have had some questions posted earlier. There are two questions from Leonel from Honduras. I'll address them chronologically. I'll post this to the entire group, but perhaps Karen can start. Leonel was making a comment that the studies that would be in reference by Rich were, this is an observation, were conducted by specialists, which means that countries lack the capacity to carry them out due to a lack of specialists. A lack of research vessels, or more likely a lack of funding. And the question is, does the Secretariat support conducting these NDFs? And multi-year monitoring is important, and Honduras urgently requires an evaluation of these NDFs resulting from the study conducted in the 2000s. There is a separate question, but I'll let first a response to that, and then we can
thank you, and thank you, Leonel, for the question. Unfortunately, the CITES Secretariat does not generally provide direct funding for individual surveys, but we are here to help in any way within our mandate and our available resources to assist you in any way that we can. But unfortunately, we do not have the funding resources to directly fund survey work. And I'm not familiar with the reports that you were referring to from 2000. So maybe you can provide a little bit more information on that, or you can contact me directly anytime.
And I do believe that there was a part of that question was posed in the chat, and Nelson did begin to respond. Nelson, do you want to?
Yes, thank you. There it is. Okay. Okay, thank you. The studies that he's referring to is the very extensive CITES review of Honduras in 2006. And remember that Honduras was not allowed to export for several reasons. And then the country, realizing the importance of developing the scientific basis for supporting their report to the CITES, established a very comprehensive set of surveys throughout the entire region, and some very significant results were produced. There are several reports. The CITES organized meetings regarding Honduras, and I, as a scientist that was hired to do the works, I went to Geneva and present the results to CITES. with the Honduran authorities, and there was a massive amount of data collected and very many different reports were submitted to the government of Honduras. This was done through the office in charge of research in fisheries and was part of the CITES scientific fisheries authority in Honduras. After the project ended in 2012, around 2012, the government has continued doing research, and there are some reports, later results on a similar type of experimental sampling designs and data collection. And the basic idea is to use part of the commercial fleet to sample different areas of the shelf and obtain the basic information. So that is my comment. Honduras obviously has a CITES management authority and a CITES scientific authority that is within the fisheries department. Thank you.
And if I may add some comments to Nelson's toward the question about having expertise and resources, what I've tried to emphasize is that this approach is flexible to the capacities that you have, but you have to have some capacity, and how you do that is, well, there are variable ways to do that. For instance, if you're looking at funding, a number of countries have gone to NGOs to be able to do surveys or otherwise implement some kind of data gathering surveys and have those properly designed using that funding. Or as Nelson mentioned, they've used the fishery, either the artisanal fishery or the industrial fishery, to do the sampling for them. And usually this takes the form of, okay, before we open the season for commercial fishing, we're first going to go to these stations and do surveys or circle transects or something to collect data on what's on the bottom. And once that's been collected, it's open for fishing. So there are ways to do this. In terms of expertise, well, there's expertise in the region, and I think a lot of countries have more expertise than they realize. A lot of information was given yesterday about the need for collecting your data in a responsible, statistically rigorous way. And most universities would have people who are experts in statistical design and sampling who could be used to guide an approach to do things like that. Or there are people on the Conch Science and Statistical TAC, what is that? Advisory Committee, Technical Advisory Committee, who could be contacted. The Caribbean Fishery Council has people who are have expertise in these areas that can provide. So you don't necessarily have to have a full range of expertise within your country if that's available from larger institutions, NGOs, etc. The other point I would make is that again, this is going to be dependent on the types of information that you have the ability to get. You don't need a research vessel unless you're trying to compete with industrial vessels. But if you want to go that way, one way to do that, and this is what Jamaica's done, they started off with a survey that was done by the commercial fishery. They now put what they call a cess on, or a tax on the based on the amount of conch being exported, and the money obtained from that is used to support their surveys, which they do every 2 or 2+ years. So since they're exporting a substantial amount of conch, that small tax generates a fair amount of income that not only supports the conch surveys, it supports data collecting for some of the other important fisheries in there. So there are ways to get the funding to do the surveys that you need, but you have to look at what you have. Lastly, the point I would make is that there's a lot of information available generically for conch that could be used to get an idea of what's happening in your fishery in terms of spawning seasons don't vary too much across the region. Growth rates do vary, but not extensively. I mean, Nelson showed a chart where, yes, there is a lot of variability in growth rates, but the age at which they're maturing isn't really varying that much. And so some information that has been obtained from elsewhere can be brought to bear in local jurisdictions, even though it's coming from someplace else. So it should not be panicking about the amount of information you need. What you should be doing is trying to fine tune the information that you can potentially get such that it's meaningful for you and helps to answer the questions about what risks you have.
Thank you, Rich. And just before we get into the questions related to the guidance, Lionel also had a question about which countries within the region have conducted NDFs on queen conch, and are the annual export quotas based on these NDFs?
Yeah, so thank you, Fadilah. And again, Lionel, thank you for that question. I'm going to say, of course, that all range states who are trading in queen conch, in theory, have made NDFs. That is the theory, because, of course, no permit should be issued without a non-detriment finding or a legal acquisition finding. But of course, as I explained that yesterday, but the CITES Secretariat, with over 40,000 species and 185 parties, we don't have the capacity to review all non-detriment findings. And so that's why we have the review of significant trade process, which I explained yesterday. So this is where for those who were not here, where the trade data, so the import and export data, is reviewed for the past 5 years. And where there are concerns about, or possible concerns about, the sustainability of the trade, say, for example, in queen conch, that is when the country will be asked to produce the proof that the trade was sustainable, and that is the non-detriment finding. And as I pointed out, or highlighted, the next selection of cases for review under the review of significant trade will be selected in July at the Animals Committee meeting. So in theory, any queen conch country, exporting country, sorry, has the possibility of being selected for review, and then they could be asked to produce their non-detriment findings. So as I said, in theory, everybody who's trading should have made non-detriment findings. The Secretariat does have an NDF database where countries are invited to upload their examples of their non-detriment findings. And I have just had a quick search there. And there is only one NDF that has been published, and that's for St. Eustatius, dating from 2014. There's also the case study that was presented at the Cancun workshop on queen conch. But the thing here with the database is that there is no obligation for parties to publish their non-detriment findings. And in relation to quotas, any quota that is established, export quota, should be based on a non-detriment finding. But again, we don't ask to see it unless there are concerns about the sustainability of the harvest. There are, of course, confidentiality issues as well around the non-detriment findings. And unless a party gives us permission to make their NDF public, we generally don't publish. However, if a country is selected for trade in Queen Conch under the review of significant trade, then the NDF that it submits would be made public in general. This is a new thing. In the past, we did not do that, but in recent years, we have been making all information submitted by the parties available. So I think they were the main points that I wanted to make. But just to come back on the previous point, a question that was raised, I'm very glad that there was reference made to all of the other resources that are out there and the assistance. It's not just from this project. But also, yes, the Queen Conch regional, there's the Science and Statistical, or is it Statistical and Scientific Technical Advisory Group, there's the WikiFC, there's the Regional Queen Conch Fisheries Management Conservation Plan. There are lots of resources out there on Queen Conch, and part of this project will be to try and create a repository of all of this useful information. A lot of it is found in the full guidance, and I would it gives a lot of good ideas about where you might be able to find that information, various ways of collecting the information. So I would advise you to look at that full guidance in detail. And also, if you can contribute any resources or information that you have, we can make that available to all the participants. And as a final plea, I would invite all range states who have made non-detriment findings and are happy to share them to upload them onto the NDF database on the CITES website so that people can see their experience and perhaps learn from the way they have done it as well. So yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say on that. Thanks.
Thank you, Karen. I don't think Rich. Rich, you have something to say on that one?
Two things. The question was, is there a country that does an annual NDF that's based on the information gathered? And Jamaica is a country that does that. They do their in-water surveys every 2 or maybe 3 years. And from that survey, they calculate what the exploitable population would be. And their total allowable catch coming off Pedro Bank is then a set percentage of that population up to a certain population size, above which it gets frozen. So you don't run the risk of thinking you could take lots and lots if you've made it, there's variability around your estimates. So to account for that, they don't want you to have fishing pressure that ends up being too high. So at some point, that amount you can take is frozen regardless of what the population size is. And then there's a lower limit where if it gets below a certain limit, the fishery is closed. So that's an example of a country that's doing this. They're basically setting this every time they do an underwater survey. They will set their NDF accordingly. The other point.
Can I just ask if they make that information publicly available, any of these reports?
You'd have to ask. I mean, I've seen a lot of them because they've asked me to comment on them. But I don't know if they're generally just made available. You'd have to ask the Jamaican authorities. The other point I wanted to make is I think something that Karen, you had mentioned to us is that the EU in particular sometimes wants to see more than just, yes, you have an NDF. They want to see what's behind that. And I would say for the US, which is the other major importer, is that they're going through a process now after their Endangered Species Act listing, where they're assessing what can they do about it from a management point of view. And I know that one of the things that's been suggested is that for conch coming in from other jurisdictions, that they require more information other than, the information behind the NDF. And I don't know whether that will go into place or not, but I know it's a recommendation that's been made. And if it does go through, that will be another reason why you want to make sure you document well what you're doing, because the importers are going to start asking for it.
Thank you, Rich. I was going to do all the answers chronologically, but I just want to address this question that was in response to something that Karen said, where she encouraged people to publish. So the question is to publish the opinions. It seems to be that it's mandatory to do so through whatever administrative unit, whether it be the Ministry of Environment, whatever the CITES authority. And the question that she has is, can it be done directly from a fisheries institution, or does it have to be done through the CITES? And that's from Laura Molina.
Yes, thank you for the question, Laura. The way that the NDF database works is that each country has a CITES focal point. So it is the role of the focal point, which is usually it's the management authority, to be the official communicator from the country to the Secretariat, and vice versa. So it is not usual. The way for the Fisheries Department to do this is to send it to the management authority and ask them to upload it. To send, or they can upload it, or they can send it to us to upload it. But if we received anything that wasn't from the management authority, we would always refer to the management authority to see that they had official approval for that country to upload that document. So I hope that answers it.
Thank you, Karen. And I just want to acknowledge in relation to Rich's comment about Jamaica, Andre Kong from Jamaica has provided in the comment that Jamaica incorporates estimates of IU fishing into the TAC, and there are reports available, and the National Fisheries Authority should be consulted for these reports.
Right.
So I'm going to get into questions related to the guidance. So Guillermo asks, and I believe everything, these would be sort of focused what's Rich now. What is the basis in step 8 for stating that most export-driven catch is more risky? And wouldn't it, in many cases, local consumption or artisanal fishing that is unreported or underreported be more risky, since it is not managed and or not properly quantified? Rich, you're muted.
So the reason that export fishing might be considered more risky is because it basically it generates an interest in harvesting as much as you can. And if this takes place as an industrial fishing effort, those each industrial fishing boat can have upwards of 100 divers and lots of boats. The fishing pressure they can bring to bear on any particular location at any particular time is high, and so the rate at which harvest can occur is much greater than what normally would be expected in artisanal fishery, because they can have the product all ready when they get to shore. It goes right into the plants and out. Whereas in an artisanal fishery, the process of harvesting and processing and getting it out is takes more time, takes more effort, and therefore the ability to say wipe out an area clean is more reduced. once, because domestic consumption is based on what you can sell and the demand of the local population. Export is being driven by demand worldwide. And that's what leads to the temptation to take as much as you can. And so that's why the risk levels associated with it, export and industrial fishing export in particular, are higher. This does not mean they can't be controlled or ameliorated by management, just where you would put the emphasis.
Thank you, Rich. And there's another question about how important is it to explicitly incorporate density thresholds and alley effects into queen conch management?
Those specific things are, well, they're tricky, okay, because you're talking about density, and density is a function of how you do your surveys. Do you know where your spawning aggregations are, and you're going to look at the densities in those aggregations? Do you know where spawning generally occurs, and you're looking in that area? Or you're looking at the whole distribution of where the species occurs and what the density over that whole broad area is? So when you build in thresholds, it's got to be based on how you're collecting the data relative to what we know. And so in the the indicators were guidelines about, if you're looking right at a spawning population, the aggregation itself, what you might want to consider. Whereas if you're looking more in kind of the general population, what you might want to consider. So it's really hard to say I have adequate density throughout, but you can say that based on the way we do our surveys, this is how we can interpret that data. For example, if you were looking over, excuse me, if you're looking over a broad area and you have an average density of 100 adult conch per area or per hectare, a survey over a whole area is probably going to have a really big mix of sites that had no conch and sites that had very high densities, so to get that average at 100. So if you're looking at something at that level, it's kind of assuming that to get that, you actually had an abundance of sites that were much higher than that, and therefore you're meeting a density requirement where those sites occur. And then you might be looking at designating those areas as designated spawning areas or something like that, and incorporating that into your management. It all depends, again, on what data you could get and how you can effectively monitor that kind of information. So looking at, so trying to incorporate spawning density is important, but trying to actually get that specific measure means you have to know where all the aggregations are. This is something Florida does. They pretty much know where all their spawning aggregations are, and they routinely sample a subset of them at some frequency to make sure that those aggregations are in place, the densities are high, and spawning is taking place. So the information you need to look at that specific density indicators requires more information up front. There are ways to incorporate the concept without having to necessarily have the exact information. And these are talked about in the document.
Go ahead, Alex.
So I just wanted to add that I think the key feature to remember with the alley effect that is a real thing with this species is that the reproductive capacity of the population will stop well before the adult population is zero. That's really, I think, the key message to understand. So from a conservative standpoint, And again, this speaks to some other questions that we might get into from John Clayton about the preservation of the spawning stock is kind of the key to the whole operation. It's the insurance policy to maintain the fishery in the future. And even if you don't have the exact number, like, we've talked about 50 to 100 adults in spawning aggregations, trying to keep that in good shape will preserve your fishery and all the livelihoods associated with that fishery, and the future of that fishery is all built on that.
Thank you, Alex. As you mentioned, John Clayton's question, we can probably go ahead and address that. So John asked, if the overall catch in a fishery is managed at a sustainable level, does it matter whether spawning aggregations are being fished or protected? And Alex, you can probably include what was already responded and then expand.
Yeah, so for the benefit of the translators, you had the question. My answer was planning for variable recruitment and climate impacts as examples rather than our examples are embedded in protecting spawning stocks. So I think it's the idea of an insurance policy, and without a spawning stock, you can't have a fishery. So the protection of the spawning stock happens at the unexploited stage that we had that graphic of the 3 stages of the of the population dynamics. So you have to have enough animals that get through the juvenile stage to become adults. And then you have to have enough adults, mature adults coming out of the fishery, so escaping the fishery to become spawners. So that is the sort of the core of the whole thing. And I wanted to comment and throwing it back to deep water populations of conch. So if we generically say that these are populations that are below 25 or 30 meters, which is, reasonable to access with diving technology that is not tech diving or mixed gas or rebreathers or anything like that, because they are deeper, but at what level is still sort of in question. The idea, and I mentioned this yesterday, that you want to consider that spawning stock as either an exploitable biomass, or those deep animals, I should say, as exploitable biomass, or because they're mostly adults, as a reproductive reserve. And you've got 2 things going on here. There's the livelihoods that you're trying to support from the fishery through extractions. But when we talk about deep water conch, we're talking about trying to preserve the lives of the fishers that are accessing the resource. Because as you get deeper, the technical aspects of diving come into play. And I've met a number of bent divers that have suffered from decompression sickness and otherwise, that are trying to access very deep populations with poor equipment at best in many cases. So again, preserving those deep stocks, understanding what they're about, how they're structured, their reproductive behavior, how they might be connected to the shallow water recruitment. These are all important, but all more difficult and more challenging because of the logistical constraints of operating at depth and the safety concerns of even the surveyors. And you can use ROVs, remotely operated vehicles, to access this. That is also expensive, technically demanding, and possibly beyond many jurisdictions to operate on any kind of sort of scale to really investigate this. So think about it as leaving those animals in place protects your fishery and also protects all the people involved to extract those resources. And again, I'm happy to follow up. But if John, if that works for you as an answer for now, we can certainly have a follow-up conversation.
Thank you, Alex. Rich?
Yeah, so a follow-up to that. John's question was based on the premise, if you are reasonably, if you have a fishery that's sustainable, do you have to specifically protect the spawning stock? And so my first question was, well, what criteria are you using to say that you have a healthy, sustainable fishery? if you do have a healthy and stable fishery, you should be meeting some criteria that says the spawning stock is being maintained because we're keeping densities, overall densities at this high level, or we don't fish in these areas, or, what's the criteria that you're using to say that you're doing something sustainable in the first place? The other point I would have is that in some places, and this is my understanding for Florida, that and somewhat for Puerto Rico, the aggregations where spawning is occurring are generally areas where adults are basically living out their lives. And it might be a subset of that area where they get together and spawn, or it might be kind of throughout that area. So there are broad areas where conch occur, and then they're separated by areas where they don't really occur. And so to say, I'm going to protect the spawning aggregation, I don't know how you do that and separate it from the fact that that's in the middle of just where the fishing would occur, because that's where the conch occur. So having a fishing aggregation specific measure might be something more like we're going to only allow a harvest for a short period of time. We're going to close some of the known aggregations. So we'll always protect some of the aggregations that we know. There are different ways to do that, but you have to have the information about how your populations and your spawners are distributed. Florida has that kind of information. Most jurisdictions do not.
Thank you, Rich. I'm going to move on to another question slash comment. This comes from Marco, and he writes that in Honduras, 3 management criteria used for the fishery: a minimum shell length of 210 millimeters, a lip thickness of 12 millimeters, and a fillet weight of 118 grams. However, recent records show that the average lip thickness is between 10 and 11 millimeters, which is below the established value and could indicate changes in population structure or fission pressure. What do these results imply for the sustainability of the fishery, and what management measures could be implemented to address the below target lip thickness values and help restore healthy population structure? Rich, Alex, or Nelson?
Yeah, I have an opinion there. One of the issues with deeper water fishing grounds like the industrial fisheries of Nicaragua and Honduras is that conchs are cracked on the bottom. The shells are not brought aboard, and therefore there is no way to enforce what is going on down there. And it is a difficulty. So the only way to kind of test what is going on is to check via surveys what is the status of the lip thickness frequency in the estimates, and then relate to the flesh weight that is being obtained. And Rich referred to this yesterday in some of the questions, that probably an indirect way to see if truly they are enforcing this. But I have very serious doubts that can be ever enforced when you have hundreds of divers down in the bottom there, and for them to select the few conchs that they are collecting, if they are mature or not, that is a big question indeed.
If I could add to that, if the criteria, as to say, the lip thickness and the shell length were based on studies, there's a couple of things that could affect that. One of those is that shell length and lip thickness have different interpretations. Shell length is going to tell you something about the size of the conch. lip thickness is going to tell you something about its maturation state, but not its size. And especially as a fishery is maturing, so it's reducing excess biomass in the population, or as recruitment occurs, the age structure will change, and maybe the size structure also changes, such that at one point, maybe the large 12 millimeter thick individuals are maybe selectively being removed. And therefore, if you're using the 12 millimeter guide, as the size of adults gets progressively smaller, you're going to find out that the meat weight gets smaller than that. So there are dynamics here, and that's why it's important to kind of see what the population is, but also to revisit your conversion factors frequently to adjust for these kinds of changes.
Go ahead, Alex.
All right, just to illustrate that, and I pulled out some shells out of my shell collection. These are both adults, 8 to 10 millimeters. They're both from Providenciales, Turks and Caicos Islands. One is the small one is 150 millimeters in shell length with an 8 millimeter lip. This larger one is 250 millimeters with a 10-inch lip. So the fact that you have both a shell length and a shell lip thickness regulation would possibly push the preservation of the smaller adults or the juveniles that grew the slowest and therefore have the potentially the lowest meat weights and the lowest fecundity. So again, like this is not a criticism, but those two measurements sort of conflict. And I think I support everything that's been said previously, but that might be something to visit or revisit and deciding on what is the best measure to regulate. And I agree that the fact that the fillets coming out of there have a minimum as well, the 118 grams, is that based on a study that looked at animals being extracted and cleaned by the industry or by the fishers on board of the processing boats potentially, and that adheres to 118 adheres to mature conch fillet meat weights? Question for the folks.
Thank you, Alex. There are a couple more questions. I'm just trying to figure out the best order. There was one from Panama, which says that Panama maintains a permanent ban on clean conch fishing. Given that it is such a sensitive resource, would decisions regarding its trade be made regionally? That is based on quota limits determined by the state of the resource in each region, as is done for other fisheries.
Not my area of expertise. I'd throw that one to Nelson just to get him talking today.
Nelson, do you have a response to that one?
Yes, I may. Yeah, I have been in Panama and I'm aware of the conch fishery there. There are such a different environment there. It's a different ecosystem, if you wish, the coastal ecosystem. Very strong currents going east along the coast from Costa Rica. And so the fisheries are localized. There are minimum amount of production there when they were authorized to fish for the conch. But in general, the character of the fishery there is so different that talking Panama kind of expanding to a general a regional model, we will need to find similar consequences in terms of how recruitment takes place. And this is very true for the spiny lobster, by the way, in Panama. Remember that Nicaragua and Honduras, they have a major spiny lobster fishery there, together with the conch. The very same thing appears in Panama, but in miniature, let us put it, and it's not offending anyone here. It's a very significantly different fishery in terms of volume, quantity, and the way they are fishing in the area. So I think Panama did well by closing that fishery when they realized that the conch was kind of disappearing from the markets and etc. There is that I know of that they don't have any formal statistical system for the fisheries there, and therefore is quite confusing in terms of what to do with the conch, and they did well by closing it. Is not significantly important in terms of the economics because of the size of the fishery.
I don't think, oh, Karen, do you have something to add to that one?
Yeah, I was just going to say that obviously from the CITES perspective, that the non-detriment finding is done at the country level. We do have some species where there is sort of a regional agreement on quotas that are shared, but these are more usually for migratory stocks or highly mobile stocks and stocks that are found in the high seas. But Queen Conch is almost entirely found in EEZ waters. You know, it's in national territories, so it's not clear what body would actually be involved in establishing quotas on a regional basis. But certainly from the CITES perspective, it would be the country itself that does the NDF within its own national waters. So I just wanted to highlight that.
Thank you, Karen. I think it seems that most of the open questions have been answered, and there are a few that were answered via text responses. I'm just flipping through to see if there's anything that we should share. The most recent one, which Alex just responded to, was from Yumira Fuentes from Belize, asking about what other technology beside VMS is suggested to assist with enforcement. So I'm not sure if anyone wants to add anything other than catch inspection, individual mass checks.
Well, I was just going to say that, you know, technology is certainly very useful in many ways. And VMS is a very elaborate and expensive system to implement, and Belize has tried that at scale. I'm not sure where Belize is at right now with that, where are using smaller sailing vessels as little mother boats for extended trips and tracking those not only for monitoring fisheries activities, but also as a safety feature. But again, I'm not sure where they're at currently. But some of the low tech things are just really like looking at the catch, you know, spot inspections of product. In this case, this would be conch meats at some level of cleaning that adhere to whatever is the current minimum of that, because again, the shells are rarely, if ever, brought on board anymore. And so that is sort of a low tech, which is still a very applicable option, especially in an artisanal fishery.
Thank you, Alex. Doesn't seem that Richard and Nelson have anything to add. And I'd just like to put forward this question that was raised earlier that was already responded to via chat from Michelle from Curacao, where he presented the reality of these islands. In Curacao and Bonaire, there is no queen conch fishery statistics. There are no records of catches. And in Bonaire, it is forbidden to catch conch. And in Curacao, you can catch conch with a shell length larger than 18 centimeters. The few inventory surveys that have been conducted, which were financed by temporary projects, show there are hardly any adult conch left in the population and mostly juveniles smaller than 18 centimeters. There are a few fishermen active in collecting the juvenile conch around Bonaire and Curacao, but these fishermen are not easy to re-educate, not even by fellow fishermen. Also, some fishermen collect conch at neighboring islands, such as Venezuela, which is also not recorded. And enforcement of the Queen Conch fishery regulations is almost absent. And so the question is, what do you suggest as a first step to improve the situation? Alex would have already suggested trying to get information from recreational dive operators to locate remaining populations, especially the adults, and also accompanying conch fishers if they're willing and in support of their livelihoods. So I just wanted to pose to Rich or Nelson, or even if Alex had anything else to add, a comment to this question.
The basic problem there is that the tourist industry demands conch, and therefore the product is being seeked somewhere else. And the question then is difficult in the sense that as demand increases and there is no local supply, the cost of conch per pound, let us say, goes up significantly. And therefore, there must be some sort of a legislation, for example, to just ban fishing for conch in the islands and accept only a permit for the import of products from overseas, say. But these are very difficult political decisions, obviously. Very difficult. I know that some shipments from the let us say Western Caribbean go to the region of the islands there to supply what is missing. Last year, for example, here in Miami, conch in the supermarkets, the value of the pound went to $30 per pound, kind of similar to the spiny lobster. Now it's about $17 a pound. So when the supply is scarce and the demand is high, the price lures people and lures fishers, and it's business. And the question then of enforcement is to deal with the business.
Thank you, Nelson. Karen, did you have something to add to that one?
Sorry, just something that Nelson said there sparked a comment that I wanted to raise, because I have been at several regional meetings on conch fisheries with different islands in the Caribbean region, and it has come to our attention that there are many islands that do not consider island to island trade as international trade because it's all within the Caribbean. So they have not been reporting this trade. And if that is the case, then we have an underreporting of international trade in conch products. So I'm not sure if this has been resolved and if different countries within the Caribbean region are aware that this does actually represent international trade. So it was just something that Nelson said sparked that reminder for me.
I think there's also a little interesting caveat to that because, for example, within the Dutch Caribbean, if they're all territories of the Netherlands, do they all still count as one country?
Yeah, that's true. And we have that with French territories, US territories, British territories as well. So I think that can cause some of the confusion. But certainly between the non-territory range states, this represents international trade. And it's important that parties recognize that and report on the trade so that we have the countries have a more accurate picture of what is actually being harvested and traded. Thanks.
Thank you, Karen. And I think there aren't any other questions right now. The one question that does come from Kenneth from Belize will actually be covered in our next component, where Kenneth has asked, when can countries start applying for technical or financial assistance? So I think right now I'll turn it over. Oh, Rich, do you want to?
Yeah, one final comment that I didn't make in the last presentations is that all those tables for the hypothetical scenarios are in the document. So it's Appendix 1 where those are presented, so you can see those and look at them at your leisure about how things were filled in.
Okay. Thank you, Rich. Karen, I'm going to hand it over to you for about 10 to 15 minutes to go into the next steps of this process, and then we will leave some time for questions in the event that there are any questions.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'll just share my screen here. You let me know when you can. Oh, sorry, push that button. I presume you can see it now?
Not yet. Yes.
You can? Okay, let me see.
Yes, we can see.
Okay. Now I can see it. I lost it there for a moment. So I just wanted to, before I go into the next steps, I want to just give a very short say a few things about the range state questionnaires, which I mentioned yesterday. The Secretariat sent a questionnaire to all of the range states that we were able to reach for Queen Conch. We use the contact details on the CITES website. So if you do not have contact details with an email address for your country, then we were not able to reach you. We made this point. I think Belize then yesterday reached out, and we were able to get the questionnaire to them. So the first thing I would say is if you have not, or I would ask the range states to just check their contact details on the CITES website to make sure that they are up to date, so we are able to reach you. So we sent this questionnaire out a week or two before this workshop, and the questionnaire has 10 sections in it. It's quite a long questionnaire, but the questions are short, and we're not looking for lots of detail. It's just to give us a better idea of the situation throughout the Caribbean in terms of the availability of data and the scale and nature of the fisheries. We made it clear that we intend to anonymize and collate all of this information, and then that will be used to inform where there are some gaps, perhaps, that maybe some additional guidance is needed for, and also to report to the Animals Committee on this project. So you will see the 10 different areas here. It's just the respondent information, species distribution and habitat, biological and population data, harvest and fishery information, management framework, trade data, monitoring research and data management, the evaluation for NDF. So does a country think that its fisheries is sustainable for Queen Conch? Any additional comments? And then importantly, at the end, the field testing, where we are asking countries if they are interested in participating in testing the guidance for us, and also if they are interested in receiving targeted support. So I will explain that in a little more detail now shortly. So by yesterday, we had received 6 responses from Bermuda, Cayman Islands, Honduras, Jamaica, Montserrat, and the United States of America. And during the workshop, we have now also received responses from the Turks and Caicos Islands and from Belize. So I'd like to thank those countries for submitting this information. The intention was to present it here, but as we're continuing to get some information, We will build this up and then create a summary or a collation of all of the responses, and we will make that available in the Dropbox where you have all of the other documentation for the workshop. So let's get on to the next steps, which is the testing of the guidance. You've now seen how it works, all the different elements to it, the different worksheets. So with that in mind, all range states are invited to test the guidance and provide feedback. And this includes range states who have already made NDFs using a different type of methodology. So we would like you to try this and then to see how that might compare with the other methodologies that you have used. If you have not done an NDF before, it would be useful to see if you can follow the guidance, if it is if there's something missing, if you're finding some of the terminology challenging, and then give us some feedback on how it might be improved. If you do not trade internationally, excuse me, you can still use the guidance in order to assess the harvest if there is a domestic use. You can use this guidance to see if that will help you to determine if that harvest for domestic use is sustainable, and again, provide us with some feedback. So that's why we're saying, all range states can do this, and it doesn't really matter whether you have a lot of data, a little data. So all feedback will be useful. We will send a follow-up questionnaire just to provide some guidance on the sort of feedback that would be useful to us, but of course, any feedback would be welcome. What we intend to do then is to hold a regional meeting later in the year that will discuss the feedback received. And this will then agree on recommendations for updates to the guidance and any other recommendations that might be made to the Animals Committee. So I've mentioned this several times. For range states that are trading in Queen Conch, the Animals Committee will select new cases for review under review of significant trade at its 34th meeting in this July. And if Queen Conch is selected, then the range state concerned may be asked to produce its NDF. So this is a great opportunity for you to get all your paperwork and all of your data organized in case that you are asked to produce your NDF. And importantly, all range states are invited to complete the questionnaire. I've also explained that this will improve our knowledge of the situation across the wider Caribbean and help to identify gaps in knowledge for possible future work on Queen Conch under CITES, because we can also use this exercise to identify some additional areas where we might propose decisions for work at the next conference of the parties. So as we mentioned, we have some funding to provide targeted support to up to 3 range states. I should say that support will be offered to all range states that volunteer to help the guidance. And should you have any questions or require clarifications on the process, we will be here, either the Secretariat or the consultants, to offer some advice along the way. However, targeted support will be provided up to 3 range states that have indicated their interest in receiving such support. So if you are interested in receiving support, you must complete the questionnaire. So if you have not yet done so and are interested, then we will allow an extended deadline until the 2nd of April 2026. So tomorrow week. You've 1 more week to complete that questionnaire. To be eligible for targeted support, it is very important that you don't necessarily need to be currently trading in Queen Conch, but you must have some data available that can be used. This data does not need to be very comprehensive, but you must be willing to share that data with the consultants. And it's important to note that the consultants, they won't actually prepare the NDF for you, but they will assist you to apply the guidance to the information that you have. And it's also vital that the consultants work with the scientific authority of the country, as it is the scientific authority that is responsible for making the non-detriment finding. And ideally, what we would like is to be able to test the guidance across a variety of scenarios. So, for example, different scales of fisheries, from commercial to scuba, across different locations and different capacities and availability of data. So with that said, we look forward to your involvement and we welcome your participation in this important work. Thank you. I'm sure there may be some questions.
Thank you, Karen. And I think it's also worth mentioning that if you as a CITES authority have not received the questionnaire, please let us know so that we can send it to you. Because the database that CITES might have had, someone could have left, and we want to make sure that the information is getting to the right people. So if you were present here and did not notice, I think at the start, Karen might have mentioned that so far the questionnaires that have been received so far have come from Bermuda, Cayman Islands, Honduras, Jamaica, Montserrat, and the US. So if you are...
Sorry, we've also received Turks and Caicos and Belize.
And Belize.
During the meeting, yeah.
And so if you are from a country that is not mentioned, and you're not aware whether the authority has received the questionnaire, feel free to reach out to us and we can send it to you. And I do notice that there is a request in the chat from St. Lucia. And if after this event, you can also reach out to us via email. The email for both myself and Karen was included in those emails that we sent out to inform you about the meeting and the recordings, etc.
Fadilah, note that Mexico sent out a statement saying that they had filled out the questionnaire and it was supposed to have been forwarded. So check on that.
Yes. Yeah, I see that comment from Guillermo. So Mexico is another one that may require follow-up on. St. Lucia is currently working on the questionnaire to complete it and will follow it before the deadline. That's from Patricia Hubert Midar from St. Lucia. We do have time now to take any questions. I do see that there's a comment from the Bahamas, from Krista saying who the focal point is and that she will follow up to ensure that the Bahamas completes the questionnaire. But I will open the floor in case there are any questions that we can take at this time. I do notice that Andre Kong had a comment regarding products and byproducts such as pearl soups, opercula. This is discussed in the document. Pearls are very problematic, but for the other byproducts, the critical issue is to develop conversion factors that can link the volume of products or byproducts to the TAC. In other words, the volume of products must be able to be generated from the TAC. Of course, traceability mechanisms must be in place to track the byproducts with the quota of a specific producer. And also Marco would have responded on the conversion factor developed for, I believe, Honduras at currently being 3.07. But it doesn't seem as if there are any questions with regards to the next steps and the targeted guidance. There is time if people had any questions with regards to what was covered over the last 2 days. I'll allow 1 more minute to see if anything comes up. Doesn't seem that way. So if not, I would propose that we close today's meeting slightly earlier than scheduled. I would like to thank all the participants for being, I see, okay, a question has popped up from Belize. I see that it is important to know the deep water stocks, potentially the spawning stocks in Belize, and our fishery is mostly shallow water fishery. Will this have implications in developing the NDF? Rich, Nelson, or Alex, do you have a comment for Kenneth from Belize?
Well, clearly, that's all going to have come into play when they do their NDF, but I also know that they have a consultancy working now that's going to look at that fishery and probably develop a very robust system for assessing their populations in the fishery.
Thank you, Rich. Yes, I think we can follow up with Kenneth afterwards with regards to that. So yes, I think I will propose to close this meeting. We want to thank all the participants. We've had pretty good participation over the 2 days. So we want to thank you for attending and also for your engagement and sharing your experiences, your opinions, as well as asking all these questions. I would also like to thank our interpreters, Vivian and Sylvia, for keeping everyone connected and being able for us to have this conversation. So thank you again for your interpretation. I would also like to thank NOAA and the government of Switzerland for funding this work, as well as CITES for facilitating this project. And also, I would like to thank the experts that we have involved. We have heard from Alex, Nelson, and Rich over the last few days, but I also like to recognize Dr. Martha Prada, who is a powerhouse within the region when it comes to conch, and she has been instrumental in some of this work, and especially with regards to translation of some key documents. So we would also like to acknowledge Martha and her contributions to this work, but especially want to recognize Alex, Dr. Alex Chufik, Dr. Rich Appledune, and Dr. Nelson Earhart for all of their work. As I mentioned yesterday, there's probably 120 years of experience between the three of them when it comes to queen conch in the region, and they are truly some of the most qualified people to be providing this guidance to these range states. So thank you again to everyone. Thank you to our presenters who have been here over the last 2 days, Karen, Alex, Nelson, and Rich. And we will be sharing all follow-ups. I encourage you to use the Dropbox link and engage with the full guidance, the quick guidance. We will be uploading any additional resources or supporting documents that can help you in this process. If you haven't already, we encourage your country to complete the questionnaire, and you have contact details, so you can feel free to reach out to us at any point in time if you do need assistance with accessing information. So thank you all once again, and we will be in touch very shortly. And yes, we via the Dropbox, we will have copies of the presentations that were used during the workshop, and the recordings will be shared via email as we did yesterday. So thank you, everyone, and
Don't go yet, Fadilah. I wanted to say a few words.
oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Please go ahead, Karen.
No, very, very quickly, I just want to echo the thanks and acknowledgement that you made to the interpreters, to our wonderful consultants and experts. I think their knowledge and expertise in the area is unparalleled. And also to NOAA and the government of Switzerland, who have provided the funding actually for the genetics project, which is running in parallel to this, and also all the participants. But I also wanted to thank you for moderating the session. You forgot yourself and GCFI, so that's why I wanted to jump in and make sure that we also acknowledge the hard work that you have put into this, in reaching out to everybody and making sure all the documentation is available and everything. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. I also note that Queen Conch is one of very, very few species for which species-specific NDF guidance has been produced. And I think that it demonstrates the value and importance that CITES placed on this resource. And also that it also reflects the concerns around potential overexploitation. So given that, I invite you all to embrace this opportunity that you've been given, because we do not afford this to very many species. Broad taxonomic groups, yes. Individual species, no. But so you have a unique opportunity to improve the guidance based on your experience in the field. And if the level of engagement at this workshop is anything to go by, then I am very optimistic that this will become a very useful resource for all Queen Conch range states. So thank you all, and I wish you all well.
Yes, thank you, everyone, and we look forward to engaging with you in the future. Thank you all.